Welcome back to the second half of NewsBreak Live, and joining me tonight is Dr. Moe Gelbart, who's a psychologist here in Torrance, and he has his own practice, Gelbart and Associates. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having us, me.
Gelbart and Associates, as I might mention, is here, but you have another location as well, which has a different focus. Tell me what your practice offers to clients.
Well, we have a large behavioral health practice. I've been in the community 40 years. We have offices in Torrance, Redondo Beach, and Palos Verdes. Approximately 40 providers, including psychiatrists, psychologists, marriage and family therapists. And we pretty much see the range, everything from A to Z, children, adults, seniors, and for all ranges of problems. And
your practice has a lot of different focus areas. One is stress and violence at a workplace. So talk to me a little bit about that specific experience that you have.
I've been doing that for a long time, that being working with, as you say, stress and workplace violence. I used to be, probably about 40 years ago, with the LA Sheriff's Department and specialized in hostage negotiations. So I learned a lot about both the how to put a situation down, but also about the kind of people who would be involved in those kind of situations. So over the years, I've done many evaluations for what we call workplace violence evaluations, or fitness for duty. And the forward-thinking companies are wise enough to understand that people deserve a right to a safe, secure work environment. And anytime there's any kind of a potential threat, they want that person removed and evaluated to see if there's indeed a danger to anybody else.
And after the recent tragedy that happened in Parkland, Florida, this kind of goes hand in hand with violence on campus, which unfortunately we've been seeing too frequently. Do you think there could have been anything done to prevent this? Are there red flags people can look out for? I know you just mentioned your background in law enforcement, but what can people do? What characteristics can people look out for?
Well, there certainly are red flags. You know, nobody wakes up in the morning and decides to do this kind of thing. In other words, this percolates, it brews over a period of time. I'm not saying it's necessarily preventable, although this case, as I listened to the information that's coming through the news, had an awful lot of red flags thrown up. But generally, you know, people, as I say, percolate and brew this kind of violent behavior, sometimes, oftentimes beginning in childhood, and includes cruelty to animals, which this particular person had, fire setting as a young child, fascination with weapons, any kind of a history of abuse, or, you know, a victim of violence themselves, use of drugs or alcohol. Those are all factors which increase the possibility that somebody will impulsively act out.
And for people on the other end who maybe do see these type of red flags, but maybe they don't want to assume something or stereotype someone, what would you say to them? Because I think from your experience and background, it's a whole nother field.
Right. You know, it's a very difficult situation. You know, I think one of the, I don't want to be political versus psychological, but, you know, one of the problems is this is not a single focused problem. So we hear a lot of things on the news about mental health, for example. This is not only a mental health problem. So, you know, I think it's important to recognize that, like I say, it's a complex problem with many facets to it, and requires many, you know, approaches to deal with all of those facets.
When it comes to active shooter situations on campus, are there some sort of conversations that parents can have with their teens, with their young children about it? Do you think we need to start having more of these conversations?
Well, I think the children, and when we say children, it could be of any age up to, you know, in this case it was high school, the children are lead the way, so to speak, on one hand. In other words, it's really important to take them where they're at. And the most important issue, I believe, with dealing with this is letting the children discuss how they feel. Their feelings need to be respected and understood, and not whitewashed. And, you know, most parents want to be caring and helpful. So if a child talks about being stressed or fearful or angry, you know, our initial impulse as a parent is to say, oh, don't feel that way. And, you know, really that's not the thing to do, because it will shut the child down. So we need to learn to first listen and validate what a child is feeling, and let them process that feeling. That's our role as adults, is to help them process those feelings. once you begin that process of and validation of feelings, then we can begin to assure the child and assure them that things will hopefully be okay for them.
And for parents, I know many parents have a fear of sending their children to school. Like, what if something like this can happen? So is it important for parents to also voice their concerns?
Absolutely. And, maybe that's one of the hardest things about these kind of incidents is, we recognize how vulnerable we are. And when there are incidents in schools or in airports, there are things that we have ourselves done. We can put ourselves in that place. When there's violence on the other side of the world, and even as horrific as it may be, we feel empathy, but we don't feel like that could be us in any moment. And perhaps the most vulnerable place where violence can occur is in a school, because we take our most precious commodity, I say that in quotes, our children, and we place them in the care of someone else, and we assume that they're going to be safe and taken care of. And so when something happens in that environment, it kind of shatters all of our security of sorts. And yes, parents are, fearful of taking their children to school, and what could be worse than that?
Right. And as a psychologist who's been in this field for so long, what are your thoughts about these tragedies when you see it on the national news, local news, and more details are constantly unfolding about the shooter?
Well, I am, again, multifaceted. There is so much you would think one could do, and yet when working in the environment as I have, many times there's not really very much you can do at all. So it's each case is different. This case in particular seems to be like there were many red warning flags, being thrown up. But I can tell you, I very often get, the mental health laws in this country protect people, which they should. But I very often get calls from, let's say, a parent who's concerned about their adult child, and the child refuses to get help, and we can't do anything about it. It's unfortunate we almost can't do anything until the person actually does something. So you hope that whatever it is they do brings them to the attention of the authorities, but they haven't really harmed anyone or harmed themselves.
Can you expand on that? I know you just mentioned that if someone doesn't want help, you can't really drag them into your office, but what can you do? Well,
that call I get very frequently, and oftentimes not very much. You can call the police if a parent or somebody is concerned, and the police can come out. And if a person is not an imminent danger or threat to themselves or others, or if they're not gravely disabled, and gravely disabled means they're psychotic or they don't know what day it is, or they clearly out of sorts, then the police can't do very much either. So as long as a person hasn't broken the law, or is, as I say, a danger or a threat to someone else, there's very little that can be done. But if one is concerned, the best alternative is to first either call the police, or most likely is try to get the person to get some help. And if they refuse, then it becomes a very difficult situation. In this situation in Florida, unfortunately, and again, I don't think all the details have come out, but I think the person was actually under some mental health care at some point, and they deemed him not dangerous, which is, I'm not judging their capability. This is not an exact science. It's not like looking at an X-ray and saying, oh yes, the arm is broken.
Right.
We really sometimes, we can only make predictions, and we really don't know what somebody is actually going to do.
And while there are a lot of people who are left with saying, what if we have done that? But as you mentioned earlier, a lot of this stems from youth, childhood. What are some specific signs that could lead to violence amongst youth?
Well, the more adverse childhood events, ACE, there was a significant study done through the Kaiser organization, and the more adverse childhood events a child has, the more likely they are to have problem and difficulty in their life, including potential violence. So trauma early on, as I said, victims of violence, and then you see it in certain behaviors as a young child. As I said earlier, drugs and alcohol really make somebody much more likely to be involved in some of this kind of violent behavior. And then we have a society today where forget we won't get into the whole gun law and the political side of that, but even just the, I'll call it social media or video, kids are into video games and they have fake weapons and they're mowing down hundreds of people. I mean, there's this whole sort of, like I say, internet and culture that assists in driving some of these issues, I believe.
This Parkland, Florida tragedy is one of many that we've seen over the years on the news, and it really, even if you're not directly impacted, it hits close to home, whether just as a human or a parent. So what kind of feelings or fear do people have when they see this on the news, and how can you cope with it?
Well, I think the feeling, as I mentioned, is extreme vulnerability and anxiety, and always that sort of putting yourself in that place and fearing that could happen to me. I could be the one walking. My child could be in that school, or I could be in this location when, in Las Vegas, when somebody decides to at just a concert to go do this. And so what we can do is basically make sure we are talking about our feelings. Our feelings are very, very important. They're very real to us. We should not worry about whether they're right or wrong. And the more we can communicate about how we feel and have other people that we're close to and discuss those feelings, the better off we are. Things people shouldn't do is repress those feelings, drink them away, some other form of denial, and because then that's going to lead to more significant emotional issues around those feelings. So communication is the big thing.
So is that what you would call coping, communicating?
That's a coping skill, yes. That's the most important coping skill for this kind of fear and anxiety.
Okay. Anything else people can do?
Yeah, the other thing is
because not everybody loves to talk, right, about their feelings.
I think you have to, let's say another thing about feelings. I think you have to be able to examine your own thinking and at times rework your thinking. So sometimes we have what we call irrational thinking, but not irrational in the sense that it's not realistic. But whenever we find ourselves thinking in terms of always or black and white kind of thinking, generally there's a gray in the middle. And if we can find the gray area of thinking, then we can feel better. So for example, if I say to myself, I'm never going to feel good at going back to that school. That's a black and white kind of statement. Then I'm going to feel stressed and anxious. And I have to take a step back and say, well, wait a second. It's okay to be stressed and anxious, but I can't say I'm never going to feel that way. Maybe some days I'll feel worried about going to that school, and other days will be okay. And before I know it, I'll get over it. So I'm not denying how I feel, but I'm sort of finding that gray area in the middle.
Okay. So coping is definitely important and talking about it. Is there anything else you'd like to add about this topic? I know it's a wide topic and a lot of people can have different opinions on it. So,
yeah, if I can, I've been thinking a lot about this in the last few days, and especially today, and I think that the approach or the political approach or what we hear in the news about how to handle this, when people go to a single focus, I think they're missing the point. So in other words, if it's not about gun control only, it's not about mental health only, it's about a wide variety. It's cultural, it's gun control, it's mental health, and unless we begin finding a way to approach all of that, and it's really, I don't believe that, it's very difficult, but it's not impossible to get a handle on what is turning into this incredible, painful epidemic that we have.
And Dr. Gelbart, before we get into more details about how people contact you, I do want to mention that you are the director of the THELMA MGMILLEN Center for Alcohol and Drug Treatment at Torrance Memorial Hospital, which you mentioned earlier, and you guys have an adolescent program as well as an adult one. So if you want to touch about that.
Yeah, it's called the THELMA MGMILLEN Center. It's been there 27 years as an intensive outpatient program for the treatment of drug and alcohol problems. And our adolescent program is similar, and it works with kids 13 to 18. And as I said, we've had a great success in the community in working with a really difficult problem.
Well, Dr. Gelbart, thank you so much for your time and joining me in discussing this topic.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
And if you would like to get in touch with Dr. Gelbart, you can go to Gelbart and Associates.com. You can always give them a ring at 310-257-5751. And they have 4 locations in the South Bay. Well, that does it for NewsBreak Live. Torrance City Council has the night off, and if you ever have news or a video that you'd like to share, please email us at newsbreak@torranceca.gov. For Facebook and Twitter users, please use #NewsBreakLive. Have a great night.